That's funny.
Yeah, one of my very early podcasts was thankfully the guest was a dear friend of mine and did the whole and it was a great show. And when you redo a show, it's never as good as when you did it spontaneously.
No,
Because
right.
in my brain, I'm trying to recreate the moments that I remember from the first time, and it never ever works out the way I want it.
That's awesome.
So, I'm like, hey Dave, I'm an idiot. Do you mind? He's like, yeah, you're an idiot, and I don't mind.
Right.
All
That's
right,
awesome.
let me double check. We've got the mics on. Mics are good. Your mic sounds good. All right, I think we're in good shape. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Up next on Inside Vintage Racing, SVRA, and 2025. Welcome to this episode of Inside Vintage Racing. I'm Brian Bielanski. Episode, I'm going to say 7. It's amazing. On the other shows, we're in the hundreds, and I can't remember which episode we're on. We're only on episode 6 or 7, and I've already lost count, but that's good. That means we're kicking them out and having a great time with it. Joining me today on the show is the president of SVRA, Michael Printup. How you doing, Michael?
Hey, Brian, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let me make sure I got the title right. I don't want to mess up the title. President, right?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. We start every show the same way, and with the same question, and it is a simple one, but sometimes it's not. And that is, how did you get mixed up in this crazy sport that we love?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll give it to you real short.
It's a podcast, Michael. You don't have to be short with it.
I started off with Roger Penske out at California Speedway as a general manager when we built that track in '96 and opened up in '97. And then NASCAR bought that, and then I migrated to NASCAR. I went from California to Michigan, and just fell. I was always a motorsports head, but so then I fell in love with motorsports and started. It was my career. I bounced around with NASCAR for a couple different locations. I was a lobbyist in New York City when we tried building the racetrack at Staten Island.
Mm-hmm.
I bounced back to Michigan and then ended up as 14 years as the track president at Watkins Glen International.
Nice.
Then I met Tony Perella,
right,
who owns Perella Motorsports and who owns SVRA. He bought that 13 years ago. And I met him, obviously, because he was a client of Watkins Glen International. And then 14 years later, I retired.
No, you didn't.
And I retired for a whopping 3 weeks. And Tony called me and says, "You can't retire. You're too young." And he made me a deal that, the proverbial you can't retire. You're too young. I got a deal for you. And he made me a deal. And I said, you know what? I am. I came out of retirement after 3 weeks and joined SVRA and Perella Motorsports. And that was last year, July. So
yeah,
I've been having a ball ever since then.
Yeah. I didn't know you were involved with California Speedway. I have to ask the question. We're out here in California. That Speedway's maybe changing into something, and I say maybe because I'll believe it when I see it. It makes me sad because I've got great memories there and seen amazing racing, both IndyCar and NASCAR. And when you hear about what's going on there, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm the same way. I mean, very nostalgic. I mean, it was so much fun to be there when we opened that place up in June of '97, and it's such a historic track. And Roger built it, more or less the same way that Michigan was built. It was an IndyCar track, a NASCAR track. I mean, we had all kinds of events out there. It was so much fun. And then I was there for the last race.
Mm-hmm. So was
I was still working for NASCAR, and so I saw the beginning, and I saw the last race, and I'm still hoping they build something out there. I think, Southern California needs a big track out there, and I think that would be a great place to be. But yeah. I'm hoping NASCAR goes back out there and does it.
Yeah, I think the problem with all California speedways and racetracks is that there's that 3-month period where no one wants to go racing because the weather absolutely sucks for racing. 90, 100 degrees, and it's just not fun. We out here stop racing from basically Memorial Day to Labor Day. That unfortunately is the prime time for pretty much every race series to be racing. So you give up a bunch of possible dates. And it's really hard, and I think that's part of the issue. So, and I've covered news in California long enough to know that anytime you start to ask for a permit to do anything, everybody in the neighborhood's going to speak up and say, we don't want you to do it. And I fear that's the process they're running into right now, is they're getting caught up in permitting hell here out in California. And it's not just California. People don't like racetracks in their neighborhood. So, fingers crossed that something good will happen out there for all of us in the motorsports world. So all of this NASCAR time, and you step back, I should say, you step into a role with an organization that isn't the behemoth that is NASCAR. How, when you say it's a deal you couldn't turn down, that had to be attractive, right? That you have more of I don't know if it's maybe a less rigid organizational structure that you get to play in?
Yeah, I think that I don't think that was the biggest attraction to me, was, getting out of the corporate world. I mean, when you spend, I only worked for 2 companies prior. I mean, I worked for NASCAR and I worked for another company out of Buffalo, Delaware North, a sports management company. And it was the structure that really, like, I report to Tony, and Tony's the CEO of the company. We sold 90% of the company last year. I knew that coming in. So Tony still is 10% holder plus CEO. And it was just that structure that really, like, you run the company, you do this, you do that. Tony just, like, he literally, like, threw the keys at me. Mm-hmm. And he goes, run with it. Let's make this a big grandbaby. And it's been a lot of fun. And Tony is obviously a great person to begin with, but he's a great boss, and it's fun to be in his organization and be able to run with him and just run with the keys.
Yeah. What's a day in the life of the president of SVRA look like?
Wow. We have so many members, our database is just our database is 30,000 plus strong. But just talking to the drivers, talking to the team owners, it's moving the schedule. The last 2 months, 3 months actually, has been working on the schedule, working with these tracks, all the tracks which I came from, and I know 99.9% of all the track presidents across the country that we deal with. So that was a good thing. But it's just relationships. It's relationship, and I'll put that on any business, any leader, any manager in the corporate world or non-corporate world, as I like to say them with Tony. We just get to have a lot of fun in organizing all this and making sure the competitors are taken care of, making sure that the rules and regulations are followed, which is really easy. It's a non-contact sport, which gives us a lot of freedom to have a lot of fun on the racetrack with these drivers.
I used to, before I got into this end of the world where I'm setting up my own stuff and doing my own thing and all of that, many years as a journalist, I used to look at the title relationship manager and kind of go, yeah, okay, whatever. And now I so understand what that means. And my wife is a networking goddess. And I am, while I do a show and I seem like I'm a little extroverted and everything, put me in a room where I've got to, meet people I don't know and have conversations, and relationship management is not my superpower. So what is that in your world? Is relationship management basically the most important thing of all of it?
I think it is. That's my goal. That's what I strive for every single day. Is like, I need to know when you put me in a room with 30 strangers and I'm going to know 26 of them when I come out of that room. It's the nature of the beast. I think for me personally, It's getting to know these people, getting to know drivers, getting to know the owners. It's so much fun. I mean, I feed off of their energy when they talk about, wow, we had such a great time at Watkins Glen. Oh, we had a great time at Road America. It's so much fun to hear their stories and why they think they are successful, and they are successful. It's fun to hear this stuff. I just, like I said, to me, it's like having breakfast, lunch, and dinner all in one meal. Like I'm feeding, and it's really cool to understand where everybody's perspective comes from. And like you, I mean, like you just said it, you're very open about it. Put you in a room, and like maybe you might not know 26 of those people, maybe you know 4 or 5 when you come out. And I'm not. It's a lot of fun for me to get into an area and start to learn. And I'm 59 years old, and I'm still learning. And I'm not going to stop.
I always like to ask people who I perceive to be extroverts if they think of themselves as an extrovert or an introvert. Where do you lie on that schedule?
I'll put myself in the middle, because I want to be careful about being extroverted, and I want to be careful about being introverted. So I put myself in the middle of that, and where I want to be and where I'm going to sit. So like I said, I put myself in the middle.
So NASCAR is a very top to bottom run organization.
Yes.
The edicts come from the top, the power comes from the top, and the customers for NASCAR and the customers for Watkins Glen at the track level are the customers, the people with the tickets who are paying to come through the gate. The customers for basically club racing, and this is what SVRA and all of the participant sports are, not necessarily the people buying the ticket to come through the gate. It's the drivers and the teams. Are you able to take stuff that you learned from the NASCAR world and the Watkins Glen world and apply that to your new customer base, or have you had to kind of rethink how you deal with things?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, Brian. I think you take your corporate experience, and again, I worked for 2 major big companies for 38 years, and then coming to a smaller company like Tony's company, there's this big difference in there, and I think the learning and the education is it's a lot of fun, but it keeps me going. It keeps me, I was a goalkeeper when I was in high school and in my 20s, soccer, and keeps you on your toes, because if you're not on your toes and you're on your heels, you're not gonna do much. And I still tell myself I'm still on my toes, and I still act like I'm still on my toes. But just learning that difference of NASCAR and my NASCAR experience and working for Roger Penske out in California. I tell you what, I learned more in 3 years working for Roger than I probably did for 10 years in any of my other careers. Roger is such a gentleman, but he also teaches you how to treat people. He also he taught us how to work with people, and he also taught you how to be the best of the best. And Roger is the best of the best, and I really appreciated that. And like you said, with NASCAR, a big corporate company, great company. The France family's awesome. They taught me a lot too, and I think that was some of the fun stuff that I got to do over my 20 plus years with NASCAR, 23, to just have some fun. But we also were given the latitude. The France family, Lisa, Jim. I knew Bill. I didn't know Bill Sr., but I knew Bill and Jim. But it is a top-down company, but a lot of companies are top-down.
Sure.
But we were giving, at the track president level, when I was at Watkins Glen, you were given the autonomy to run the business, and you were also given the autonomy to make it successful or not make it successful. And if you didn't make it successful, you probably figured out where you were going to be next.
Yeah.
But
or where you weren't going to be.
Right. But 14 years at Watkins Glen, I think was too long. I'm a student of longevity, but I'm not a student of too much longevity. And I mean, I think 7, 8, 9 years of being a leader at one place is probably about your max. And so that always stayed in my mind that, be careful, always change and keep changing. As I got older, I moved there in my 40s and then all of a sudden I'm mid 50s. We had to keep moving. And I worked for Delaware North, like I said earlier, and I worked for some really bright, brilliant young people. And we had a bright, brilliant young team at Watkins Glen, and we always kept it that way. And that was one thing that I always wanted to put the edge on. And Ashley, who and I promised her, and she told me, "Don't you dare!" But I told her I'd bring her name up. She actually worked for me at Watkins Glen in her early days, and now she works for SVRA, as
Nice.
you know, Pro Motorsports. And she's one of those bright, brilliant people, and she still is bright, brilliant. And I think that you got to keep evolving your company. You can't let a senior manager run the company for the term. And that's what I always based myself on. I was like, I always wanted to have good people, energetic, running, and I didn't run the business; they ran me.
Yeah.
And then I just guided them. I was the proverbial guide rail. I kept them in the tracks. I kept them between the lanes and kept them in the corporate path. But at the end of the day, they ran the company, and I was fortunate enough to have such a great crew for 14 years.
Yeah, and it sounds like you have this philosophy that you've got those tracks that you're trying to keep them in, but you also want to let them be right on the edge of the tracks, laying off as far off the edge as they can to give them the room to be able to be creative and innovative, because the innovation doesn't come in a straight line in the middle of the tracks. The innovation comes when you're hanging off the edges, right?
Yeah, no question. You don't want a tank slapper, and I think we all know what that is. You don't want to do a spin around and have your tank hit your front end. But that was exactly it. I was fortunate enough to have such a. I'm telling you, I put them up any track, any day. We ran 180, 185 days a year up at Watkins Glen with track rental and our public events. And you think about a Northeast track running that much. We were next to California. We were next to Daytona. We were next to Phoenix. And we didn't have good year-round weather,
right?
But we still ran some pretty popular events up there.
So, Michael, there are probably 20 names on the Mount Rushmore of motorsports worldwide. And I could probably narrow it down to 4 or 5 in North America. And you have worked for 2 of the names on the Mount Rushmore of motorsports in North America, Penske and France. Can you share with us a story before we get to the 2025 season, which is why I got you on here? Can you share with us a story about both Roger and the Frances, of something you learned or a situation that you really took away from, like, wow, this is pretty amazing?
Yeah, I could tell you about 20 for Roger because he was so intense. It was so much, but it was intense, but it was so fun. But the attention to detail with Roger, and I'll give you one. It's kind of a corny story, but we were ready to open. We're like a couple weeks out from opening up the California Speedway, and I had 20 Penske truck leasing trucks out there just to move equipment and move things around, and out there, and I mean in the parking lot. Mm-hmm. And he came in my office, and he's like, "Come take a walk with me." And I took a walk with him, and the trucks weren't lined up, bumper to bumper to bumper to bumper. He says, "Get a piece of rope," and he goes, "Put 2 people on the end, put somebody in the truck, and push them to that rope." He goes, "I want every truck lined up." And my immediate reaction to Roger was, I'm like, "I'm going to be moving these in like 2-3 hours." He says, "Michael, get a piece of rope, line these trucks up." And we did. And like I said, there were like 25 of these trucks. and they had to be perfect because that's how his dealerships work. When you walked into a Penske dealership or a yard, or, the car lot, every car was lined up perfectly, and that's how they did it. They put a rope, they drove them up to the rope, and they lined them up so there wasn't one thing out of place. And at the time, I was busier than heck.
Yeah.
And he's making me do this, and I was like, come on, I'm literally moving these things in 2 hours. I'm thinking to myself, but I got the lesson at the end of the day. It was attention to detail, make it right, and do it all the time, and not just the trucks. That lesson pertained to everything that I did. I played it back on him 20-something years later, honoring him at a motorsports research center. Board deal, and I got up on stage and I was the guy that was introducing Roger, and the chairs weren't straight, and I went out, and there's like 10 chairs in the front row, and I went up and straightened them all out, and then I invited Roger to the stage, and I said, Roger, that one's for you.
Did he get it?
He got it.
That's awesome. How about
the France family? They much different than Roger. I mean, and I don't mean that in a bad way, of course. Much different. I learned more of the corporate side. Roger wasn't corporate, even though he was a billionaire 10 times over. He could be corporate, but the France family was more of a corporate world, and we worked very strategically. And this is what I think the France family was very good at: is strategically we laid the business out 2, 3, 5, 7 years ahead. Of course, that document was always pliable, and we could always move it around. But the France family taught a different perspective of that. And I learned more. I learned some from Lisa when I worked for her when I was in New York City, when we were trying to build that racetrack in Staten Island. And I also learned some stuff from Bill. And I'll never forget one story with Bill when I was in New York City, and I made a decision up in New York City that wasn't the most favorable decision for the company. I didn't know it at the time. I thought it was the right decision. And Lisa called me and goes, my dad wants to talk to you. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's like being called to the hauler. You don't want to be called to the hauler.
Right.
And Bill called me 5 minutes later. And I'm like, yes, Mr. France. And he walked through and he asked me what I did and how I did it. Again, long story there, but I made a decision. And he paused, and there was like this moment of silence. I was like, uh-oh, here it comes. And all he said to me was, Michael, that's like peeing in bed to keep yourself warm. Don't do that again. And I hung up the phone, and he hung up the phone, and I was like, oh, I got it.
Yeah.
Because it didn't last long. Peeing in bed to keep yourself warm is not going to last long.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
So,
yeah.
But great companies, great people, great company.
The one thing I'm always impressed with NASCAR, and they have embraced a segment of the population that is not necessarily traditionally a big part of motorsports, and that is women. And putting women in positions of power. And I look at some of their track presidents now are women. Lisa France, obviously a big part of the organization and a huge part of the organization. And they were kind of the first organization to open the doors, right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at it, and I'm 50% Native American, so.
Oh.
Yes, Seneca Indian from New York. So I was one of the first minorities that was hired as a track president. There was one article put out on it. It was like, I wish there would have been more. I'm proud to be a minority in the business. But to your point, you have a track president. You have a female track president out of Phoenix, Richmond, Watkins Glen. And then, outside of Lisa, and I think that she's done a great job with leading the company, NASCAR company, in the efforts of diversifying the human resource capital of NASCAR. Because as we all know, 10 years ago, it was a white male sport.
Yeah,
in the
absolutely.
Story. That's what it was. And I was the Lone Ranger. Pardon the pun.
Yes.
I was the Lone Ranger out there.
That's awesome.
As a minority, and Gillian Zucker was the only other minority, and she was the president at that time. She was the president of California Speedway, and she'd worked her way up with the NASCAR family as well. And she moved on to the LA Clippers.
Yep.
But just great stuff. I'm glad that it's happening. I'm glad it's out there. Again, just for all support of diversity in the sport, I think Lisa and the company have done a great job.
Yeah, I know why you stuck around at Watkins Glen as long as you did. My wife is an Ithaca College grad. And if you can handle winter, I grew up in Wisconsin, and I went to school in Minnesota. If you can handle winter, Watkins Glen, the Finger Lakes, is maybe one of the slices of gold in the entire world as a region to live in.
There's no question about that. My wife and I, we're empty nesters now, so my wife and I just spent 7 weeks up there to escape the heat of Charleston, South Carolina, and we went up there for 7 weeks. We just got back last week. It's so beautiful, and to your point, it's just it's a great place to be April through November.
Exactly, yeah. The snowbirds go south for the winter from the north. If I had it my way, I would do exactly what you did, either at Road America area or Watkins Glen. Those are the two perfect places to spend basically May through September.
yeah, right. I mean, I was just up, obviously we were just at Road America a month ago, and just it's such a beautiful place, and it reminded me so much of what the Watkins Glen area.
Yeah.
It's just pretty. And my family is I'm born and raised in Buffalo, so I still have a brother and sister and another brother up north in northern New York, but brother and sister in Buffalo, which is only 2.5 hours away from Watkins Glen. So it was great to be back up with home and family and in 75-degree weather versus 97 down here.
Right. So let's talk vintage racing. Let's talk SVRA. So I've had a couple of organizations on who were a little new to me, and coming up in the motorsports world as a flagger. That's how. Well, I started with my dad as his crew chief on his club racing cars. Spent a lot of time as a flagger, and there's two pretty big organizations here in the U.S. that do vintage racing. It's SVRA and HSR. And I didn't realize that there were so many smaller regional organizations out there who do this as well. And I've had a couple of those on the show, but SVRA is the first of the biggies on the show here. So tell us a little bit about what SVRA does and kind of what the world of SVRA is all about.
Yeah, it's a great lead in. It's I think the best way to start off this comment or conversation is some people collect art and we race it.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a tagline of Tony's. Tony bought the company 13 years ago. It was a $250,000 a year revenue, and he's built it into a multi-million-dollar business. Just exploiting and celebrating the vintage racing, and then I think celebrating is probably the best word. Is taking all the different cars that come out. It's a non-contact sport. There's no bumping and grinding into the corners. It's not a pro series. These are men and women that just enjoy running their cars in their separate classes throughout the country. And I think that's our diversity goes from Portland all the way to Lime Rock, Connecticut. And we have 23 races next year. We have 19 SVRA races on the schedule for next year. And I think it gives people a place to celebrate, and it brings them together. And I think, my opinion, the drivers, the men and women of this sport, they love being in the paddock, talking with each other and looking at cars as much as they enjoy being on the race course. Sounds kind of weird because you want to get on a race course, you're on a professional course, you're a licensed driver. You could do, and I'm making this up, you can do 180 miles an hour, or you can do 90 miles an hour, whatever your car can do, and you can go out there and just really have fun. But the paddock is just as much fun, and I think that's where we celebrate SVRA. We celebrate all of that. Again, you collect art, we race it, and I think our competitors just really have so much fun doing that. That it really entices them to join from race to race to race, whether it's starting in Sebring or ending in Coda, and we go to nostalgic tracks. I think that's what really separates us, is that when you can go to Coda, or you can go to Road Atlanta, or you can go to Sebring or Watkins Glen, and you can race some of these most historic racetracks in the country, if not in the world. People know these racetracks and they want to be there. And I think that's what gives us our strength, is that we go out and we rent these tracks for a weekend or 4 days, whatever it might be. And these competitors get to put a badge of honor on their sleeve and say, look, I race Coda. I race Watkins Glen. I race Road Atlanta. I race Sebring. It's pretty nostalgic when you really start digging down and you look at these competitors and what they're trying. They're not going for money. Right. This is all trophy based. Right. I mean, they're racing for a trophy. They're racing for a red hat. It's just the winner's hat. Only the winners, only the podium people get the red hat, and they're racing for a medal. Sometimes they're racing for a gold bell helmet. But I think that's what, I know that's what drives our competitors to be the best of the best. And they just like having fun with us. Yeah.
It's funny. I when I've been to vintage races and I always love, as you said, walking through the paddock. And there's two types of vintage cars. There are the cars with the grand provenance, the ones who were driven by the Mark Donahues, the ones who were driven by the Dan Gurneys, and those are amazing cars to stop by. And vintage racers love. Do you think they love talking about their cars more than they love driving them?
I would definitely say yes to that question.
So you walk up to the owner of those cars, and they, of course, will have all the info, and they'll talk to you about it, and they'll talk, and they'll talk, and they talk. But then you've got a guy who is a little further down the paddock row who's driving a Pinto. And you walk up to him, and he is going to have just as much information and just as much love and just as much passion for his Pinto as someone who owns the Roger Penske Sunoco Mustang or whatever it was, Camaro or Mustang from back in the day. And it's just as much fun as a spectator to go and talk to the guys with the cars with the provenance as it is to talk with the guy with the Pinto. And I think that's amazing.
It's funny you say that. That's exactly what it's about. And I think that the other thing, now you bring the fan element into our sport, and so now the fans literally are walking up, as you included in your comment. The fans are walking up, talking to these owners. We don't put a rope around the cars. We don't stand back 10 feet. You can literally walk up and like lean on a tire and talk to the owner or the driver or whatever it might be. And I think that's what brings our sport closer to the heart of a true racer.
There's this old saying, I went to a hockey game, a boxing match, and a hockey game broke out. It's like going to a car show and a race happened. Yep. And every weekend, and there are cars out there. I mean, and I've been around this sport for 35 years. There is very little I haven't seen. But every time I go to a vintage race, there is, whether it's a little small one or a big event like you guys put on, there's always a car there that I'm like, where in the world did that come from? And how have I never seen this car before? I'm always amazed and surprised at the stuff that shows up at a vintage race like SVRA.
Yeah, I that's a great way to put it. And I just was surprised a few weeks ago. Tony, the Perella, the owner of the company, he lives up on just north of Watkins Glen, and I was up at his house. He's like, "Hey, come out to the garage, see what I bought." And I thought I knew cars. Yeah. And I say that with passion. And he takes me out to the garage, and he's got this night, and I'm making up the year because I can't remember. He's got this 1942 Zephyr. There was 300 of them built by the Ford family. and it's in primo condition. And I'm looking at this car. I've never seen this car before. I was like, oh my gosh, it was so impeccably, obviously taken care of. But only 300 of them were made.
Yeah.
And Tony bought one.
I'm always, when I go to a vintage race, when I see some of these cars, first of all, I say to myself, how did they ever run? Number one. Two, who decided that should be a race car? And number three, in 2024, sometimes 100 years after that car was built,
yes,
they're still able to find parts or make parts, probably more so than finding parts, to keep that car not only able to drive from the garage to the trailer, but to make 20 laps on a racetrack.
Right.
That is crazy.
It is crazy. My father-in-law still lives in Southern California, and he bought a beat-up Model T, and he had it completely redone from engine to transmission, all to original, and he had to have it spec'd out. This was just a pet project, and I got to ride in it. It's got the old buckboard. You push it, and I'm making this up.
Yeah.
You had to push the gas 3 times, hit the brake twice. Hit the lever 3 times, and then you push the start button, and then it started up. And I got to do. I didn't drive it, but I was a passenger. Got to ride a little in the parking lot after he was completely done with this, and it was like that. That was art.
Yeah.
It was art on wheels, and it was only his passion to do it. He's not a vintage racer. He doesn't do any of that stuff. He just wanted to do it for the heck of it. But to your point, all the parts had to be custom made. You had to go find shops that would make it. Go on, blah blah blah. But what a car! Like you said, when you walk in and look at these cars and go, "Oh my gosh, how did this even go a mile?"
Yeah.
Let alone 20 laps around a racetrack.
I have an uncle that before he retired, he bought an old Jag and restored it. Took it all the way down to the frame and restored it. Went around the world to get parts for it, so it was proper parts. And I figured it out eventually. I think he was going around the world. He could have had those parts shipped to Chicago, but I think the traveling around the world to get the parts was to keep his marriage alive. And the more time he went to get parts, the less time he was at home, and that's how he got to be a 60-year anniversary marriage kind of thing. But that too was his passion, and he never put that on a racetrack. But so there's a lot of the vintage world that aligns, but there's a place for everybody in that, right?
Yeah, and that's the passion.
Yeah,
I mean, you see it in these competitors, and you see it in the drivers, and you see it in the owners. Because there's some owners that don't race their car, they bring somebody else in to race their car in our vintage world, and it's just a lot of fun to be able to do it. And it's regional and it's national all at the same time.
Yeah.
And we get people from New York that go to California, you get people from California that come to New York. And then you've got people in Chicago that only go Wisconsin, Chicago,
right.
Indianapolis, that circle. So it's a really regional at the same time. And we put record numbers of cars at places like Coda and Watkins Glen, Road Atlanta. When you're getting 200, 300, 400 SVRA cars,
Indianapolis,
it's one single event for a weekend. It jams up the schedule, but I'm telling you what, there's nothing prettier than seeing all these cars coming.
Yeah. So let's talk about the schedule. You've got, I didn't count them, looks like about 25, 23 races maybe.
Yeah.
Open at Sebring. I mean, you're right. You hit all of the iconic North American tracks: Sebring, Road Atlanta, Sonoma, Watkins Glen, Road America, Indy, Mid-Ohio, Watkins Glen again, Circuit of the Americas. But then you also go to places like Eagles Canyon, a little gem of a racetrack in Texas. You go to Portland, which I think is one of the coolest places to go race cars. I got to Portland for the first time this year.
Good.
With the SCCA Super Tour, and Thunder Hill, which is kind of a private club track in Northern California. A lot of people don't get there for there's no pro racing at Thunder Hill. Barber, which is another kind of slice of American gold down there in Alabama. There's not a whole lot missing as far as locations on this schedule.
No, that's the attraction. And I think that's where Tony has built such a great repertoire of road courses and racetracks throughout the country. and obviously come from the racetrack world. He again threw me the keys and said, "Hey, let's go." And we were able to put this 2025 schedule together. And now we took NOLA off the track for Trans Am, but we're going there for SVRA, and we took we took St. Louis off as well, Worldwide Tech off of the schedule for next year completely. But all these other racetracks, like you said, what other track can you go to besides Daytona is really the only one that we're missing on our schedule, if you want to call it super nostalgic. We just haven't been able to find a date and/or put everything together. Let's just put it that way, for the pieces to go to Daytona. But we do. Our schedule, and adding Barber this year, that was Tony's idea at the beginning of the year. We started talking to him. We took him to Road Atlanta early, obviously very early this year, back in March, and just to show them what we can do and how we do it. And it's a marriage. It's not a one-way street. Just don't go rent a track and go, I'm going to rent your track and pay you a lot of money to come. We want to make sure it works for both parties. And Barber, what a nostalgic track, and the museum that's there. And so we're gonna go there and have a ton of fun this year. I can't wait. And what's weird is I drove by it for 27 years. I used to stay in Birmingham when I went to Talladega.
Right.
And, I drive right by Barber every single day. So I never drove the track. I never saw the museum. But I can't wait to go see Barber. Parker and his team down there, Barber, just they're incredible. And I can't wait to be there.
Maybe you can slide your track manager hat on back for a second. A lot of the club organizations are there's kind of a new world order when you go to a racetrack these days. Their tracks are really clamping down on off-track incidents, charging back to the clubs for a bent-up guardrail or per bag of Speedy Dry that they throw down. and other than Speedy Dry with vintage cars, you must be the dream tenant because your cars, your guys get penalized for contact, and you guys get penalized for going off track, and vintage racers must kind of be the dream tenant. It just might need 3 times as much Speedy Dry for a vintage weekend that you do for another weekend.
Boy, you hit that one on the head. My last year at Watkins Glen, we had like 4 or 5 vintage cars. I was still at Watkins Glen at the time. Yeah. We had 4 or 5 cars dump lots of liquid, yes. And I'll leave it at that. 2.5 pallets of Speedy Dry. So there's 62 bags on a pallet.
Wow.
And they dumped that much product. It took us over 2 hours to clean up the racetrack, which is not fun because that only damages the race content. But yes, otherwise that was an anomaly that usually doesn't happen. Yeah. I mean, we came off of Road Atlanta, we came off of Watkins Glen. I mean, we used like 3 bags of Speedy Dry at Watkins Glen this past year, of course, because we get the bill. As you said, they charge you for everything. It is what it is. But yes, I think from an SVRA side, being non-competitive in terms of no bumping, no grinding, you're not hitting the guardrail at 140 miles an hour, or you're not hitting a tire barrier, which causes another $20,000 worth to fix it. We are a very
low maintenance.
We're very pro track, and we're very light damage on the track as well.
Two questions, last questions before we let you go, because you're a busy guy, and it's coming up on 6 a.m. out here on the West Coast, and I got the survival job to get to. So, what is the thing that when you moved from the NASCAR track president world to SVRA, what was the one thing that surprised you? What was a situation you ran into that you just weren't expecting? Was there one thing that kind of sticks out in your mind in that first year or something?
Yeah, because it's been just over a year since I've been with the company. I think the biggest thing is the corporate structure. When you grow up in corporate America, like I did with my 2 prior companies, NASCAR and Delaware North, you have this corporate structure. So when you have an accounting question or you have a legal question, you just pick up the phone and call, the bank of attorneys, the bank of accountants, and we don't have that. We're a smaller company. So it was adjusting to that. And then I think the biggest adjustment for me personally was we're a remote company. I mean, we have 60, 70 employees from Vermont to Northern California. There's no corporate office. There's no corporate, get-togethers. And there is when we go to racetrack.
Sure.
And then we hold weekly calls. So you're always on Zoom calls and you're trying to connect. You don't walk down the hallway and walk into the accountant's office or the PR. You don't walk in. I don't bump into Ashley down the hallway. You got to pick up the phone, which is not a big deal, but that was a big change for me.
Sure.
Coming from corporate America, where you have all these resources, and then you go to a smaller company. You go from $1 billion company down to tens of millions dollar company, and it makes a difference.
People who watch my shows will giggle at this moment because whenever I say I've got two more questions, I then follow it up with, I lied, I've got another question. So maybe not now, it's two more questions.
Sure.
What's your favorite part of a race weekend? Do you get to go to most of the races?
Yes.
What's your favorite part of a race weekend?
The beginning. I love when the green flag comes out. I love that. It always, I don't care what race I'm at, whether it's a SVRA, Trans Am, Formula One, IndyCar. It just, I don't know. There's like the little hairs in the back of my neck go, yeah, we did it. And I do say that. And then I have a saddest moment too, which is just the opposite. It's the checker flag on Sunday. When that checker flag comes out, it's like, it's over.
Yeah.
And it's like, we had so much fun, and the team, and I always reflect because I've been doing this for 35 years. It's so much fun to sit there and go, wow, we did it. And I just look around me and go, this team is awesome. And what we do to put on an event is, and again, being a remote company, we talk to each other on Zoom. We all show up at events. Everybody does their job. Everybody pats each other on the back, and everybody leaves. But Sunday night is my saddest moment, and Thursday or Friday is my happiest moment.
Yeah, I'm an announcer, so I'm at the track usually before the sun comes up.
Yeah,
and Saturday and Sunday morning, I find a spot at every racetrack where I experience sunrise, and I try to get out of the booth, find that spot, and what I enjoy is I've got a spot at every track, but when I go to a new track, finding that spot that I want to experience sunrise. And I first started doing this at Daytona at the Rolex 24. After being in the media all night long, doing my thing, sun started, it's like I got up on top of the garages to look out over turn 3. And that became a tradition for me. So that's my favorite part of a race weekend now. Just sunrise at any racetrack.
That is so awesome. And I'm going to put you in the same bank as Emerson Fittipaldi.
That's a good bank to be in.
Yeah, it's a good spot to be in. Emerson, long story short, came to Watkins Glen on his 40th anniversary of winning at Watkins Glen. So it was probably 2012, I believe. And he came up and we were walking the track. And he said, Michael, I want to get up in the grandstand. I want to go sit in that seat up in the corner. And he goes, I just want to reflect. He goes, would you mind just watching my son for me for a couple minutes? He had a 2-year-old son. And he goes, I just want to reflect. And I'm like, you got it. And I took his 2-year-old son, and we went, 50 rows below him because he went up in the top right corner. And he sat there for half an hour doing exactly what you just did, or what you said. And he was just reflecting. And I was like, I wish I could be in his brain. It was just, and he came down and he just said, all right, I'm good, let's go. And that was it.
Yeah, for me, it's 5 minutes of gratitude. For me, that's what it is. I get to spend my time. I work my butt off to be able to do so. Yeah. I get to spend my time at some of the most beautiful places in the world, hanging out with people who love cars, and it's 5 minutes of gratitude for me. So, all right, my final question. This is really truly my final question. I promise. What excites you about 2025? What's on the horizon? What excites you?
Wow. I tell you what, we've gotten, and the entire team and myself, we've gotten so many phone calls on our schedule. Best schedule ever. I can't believe this is happening. Look at what you've done. And it's not me. It's working with the racetracks. It's the excitement that I'm hearing from the drivers, owners, whether it's Trans Am, whether it's SVRA, whether it's JSF4, F4 with Scott Goodyear, who I get to work with on a daily basis, who I used to idolize when I was a kid. I tell him that, and he says, "Shut up." I mean, Scott Goodyear and I work together, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm working with Scott Goodyear." You know, it's like, I don't know. I'm a racer. You know, like like what you said. I take things very lightly, and I like to appreciate what's in front of me. But yeah, I think just the combination of what we're hearing from the competitors and drivers about the intense schedule that we have next year. We cut one race off from 20 versus 23 or 24. And then we've added a couple things. We're doing 2 all-star races next year. One in Sonoma, one in Lime Rock. We did one in Lime Rock this year, very successful. So it's just the intensity of the schedule, but it's also the spacing. We spaced out a lot more. We didn't have 7 back-to-backs like we did this year. We had 7 back-to-back races.
That's good. That's a
March,
run.
April, May. And
that's very NASCAR-esque.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not what we're trying to replicate.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think just the schedule alone and the spacing and what we have and the regionality and and what we have and the demographic that fits our racing competitors, we're ready to go, man. I'm telling you what, I know 24 is coming to an end here. We got VIR coming up in a couple weeks, and then we got COTA in Spring Mountain out west. And that wraps up our year, and then we get to start planning because off season's busier than on season, believe it or not. And I'm looking forward to it. I can't wait.
Awesome. So the bigs are busy. I always say that whenever I get one of the bigs on the show, I say the bigs are busy, and I don't want to bug you all too often. But let's try to circle this time next year when you announce the 2026 schedule and get you back on the show because I love this conversation. I appreciate it.
No, Brian, thank you. I mean, you are very well respected in the community, as you well know. It's great to be on your show. And I appreciate you taking time to do this with me.
All right, he's Michael Printup, the SVRA president here on Inside Vintage Racing. That's going to do it for another episode of Inside Vintage Racing. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the Racing Wire Podcast Network and the Racing Network on YouTube. It'd also be great if you leave a comment, especially if it's a good one. Follow us on social media to find out who our next guest is and leave a question on Twitter. It's Racing Wire Net. A new episode of Inside Vintage Racing every week. I'm Brian Bielanski. Have yourself a fantastic weekend. Stay safe and go play with cars.